The chamber of static reflection on Xylos, the progenitor world of the Vesnara hegemony, was not a place built for comfort or even for sound. Its monolithic architecture, carved from the deep red ferrous rock of the planetary core, was engineered to absorb all stray resonance, all echoes of anxiety or political fervor, leaving only the crushing weight of pure, unadulterated thought, a necessary cruelty for a species whose history had been defined by the cacophony of internal dissent. The 9 sages of the conclave, the living embodiment of the hegemony's collective intellect and its decaying political will, sat suspended in their anti-gravitic harnesses around a disk of shimmering, unstable chromium, the surface of which displayed the relentlessly advancing vectors of the blight. Each sage, centuries old and steeped in the philosophical calcification of an empire that had believed its trajectory to be immutable, projected an aura of profound, weary resignation. Their crisis was not a siege. It was an entropic decay, an existential corrosion that defied all traditional military calculus, dissolving the very informational matrices of their core technology, turning their star systems into zones of silent, irreversible failure. This was the moment where all the accumulated wisdom of the Vesnara lineage had been reduced to the agonizing stillness of inevitable collapse, a fate rendered more bitter by the deep, ingrained arrogance that had precluded any consideration of external assistance for millennia, a conceit that now clung to them like funerary shroud. The senior sage, Kalen, whose sensory filaments traced intricate patterns against the cold air, finally broke the enduring silence, the subtle modulator on his throat only just granting his voice the necessary presence to overcome the room's oppressive dampening field. His pronouncement was not a question, but a condemnation of their collective failure and the unsettling, newly emergent variable that had been thrust upon their dying attention. We have exhausted the runic protocols, activated the final contingency ciphers, and offered the entirety of the hegemony's accumulated data to the void, a meaningless plea for an impossible solution. The vector delta for the collapse of the Viridian array has narrowed to the 7.2 sigma mark. We have, in the cycles of other, less structured peoples, less than 2 solar rotations before the Blight's informational cascade destabilizes the core defense grid. Hope, an abstraction we had long discarded as a statistically insignificant variable in the grand equation of civilization, is demonstrably absent from our current state matrix. Yet, against this certainty, the deep scans have registered the entry of the anomalous designation 7 Humanity into the contested sector, accompanied by their signature fleet of vessels, the nature of which remains violently inconsistent with any known physics paradigm. The term dangerous ships, as categorized by the predictive matrices, is not a hyperbolic assessment of their destructive capacity, but a literal interpretation of the unstable temporal and gravitational dissonance they project. They are fundamentally an unpredictable flaw in the fabric of the cosmos. His filaments pulsed with an agitated red shift, a visible sign of his internal conflict between the hegemony's immediate demise and the terrifying uncertainty of this new presence. Sage Zarthus, his opposite in political and philosophical temperament, a creature of hardline tradition who viewed all compromise as an early sign of cultural entropy, shifted in his harness, the movement a deliberate, loud grating sound against the chromium's field, a show of disdain for Kalen's pragmatism. Zarthus's voice, filtered through an older, more resonant modulator, carried the weight of Vesnara's ancient pride. The descriptive term is inaccurate, Kalen. The analysis is flawed by a failure to account for primitive developmental arcs. Their vessels are not dangerous in the sense of possessing unpredictable power. They are crude. The gravitational distortions are not an unstable projection of advanced theory. They are the consequence of inefficient, computationally starved drives attempting to bend spacetime through brute, uncontrolled force. Humanity is a newly emergent species, barely capable of traversing the void, and they have the terrible misfortune of entering our space precisely at the moment of our final, necessary reckoning. To distract the conclave with this insignificant biological noise, while the fate of our lineage hangs in the balance, is a luxury we cannot afford. We should activate the Sentinel array on the periphery, the one system the Blight has not yet touched, and vaporize the entire fleet as a necessary quarantine measure, a final, clean act of species preservation against the chaos of the unknown. They are drawn to the energy signatures of our collapse, like scavenging insects to a dying light, and they must be excised before they contaminate the very ashes of our empire. His pronouncement was final, laced with the hegemony's deep-seated suspicion of all external life, a suspicion rooted in the belief that their own civilization represented the apex of complexity and ethical evolution. A lengthy, charged silence descended once more, the chromium disk projecting the cold, silent truth of their terminal state. The other sages remained motionless, their internal processors cycling through Zarthus's ruthless logic and Kalen's profound anxiety. The philosophical chasm between them was not new. It represented the eternal conflict between the preservation of conceptual purity and the desperate calculus of survival. Kalen inhaled deeply, the atmospheric recycling system hissing in the background, a sound that felt profoundly loud in the vacuum of the chamber. Zarthus, your assessment is anchored to the assumption that all life follows the Vesnara developmental paradigm, a slow, controlled, linear ascent from biological necessity to intellectual transcendence. Humanity, however, displays a unique, troubling discontinuity. Our deep history behavioral analysis shows a brief, almost instantaneous jump from internecine, planetary conflict to transsystemic travel, a developmental anomaly that defies the required centuries of philosophical and ethical integration. They have transcended the technological barrier without first mastering the ethical one, which suggests a profound, inherent contradiction in their nature. They are not merely crude, they are accelerated, which makes them terrifyingly unpredictable. They land Zarthus. They are approaching the periphery of the tarnished nebula, which our ancient texts designated as Ka's retribution, the mythological point where the first Vesnara fleets faced their ultimate terrifying failure. To us, this represents the nexus of our doom, the place where all hope was lost. And now, precisely at that nexus, the humans land with their dangerous ships. The coincidence is statistically impossible, suggesting either an astonishing strategic intuition or a horrifying depth of prior knowledge. We cannot afford the risk of genocide until we understand the root causality of their arrival at the critical geographical and temporal juncture of our collapse. The debate spiraled into a grueling, formalized argument rooted in the hegemony's ancient legal and philosophical texts, each sage maneuvering for political advantage, while the very foundations of their world crumbled beneath them. It was a spectacle of political rigor, a perfect encapsulation of their fatal flaw, the prioritizing of intellectual and political process over pragmatic, immediate action. Kalen argued for a controlled, highly guarded diplomatic contact, suggesting that the very chaos projected by the human ships might be the key to disrupting the Blight's elegant informational structure, which thrived only in environments of perfect order. Zarthus counter-argued with a brutal finality, stating that if the humans were, indeed, so chaotic, introducing them into the dying heart of the Vesnara hegemony would only accelerate the collapse to terminal velocity. The conflict raged for what felt like endless cycles, the chromium disk glowing hotter with the anxiety of the projected timelines, until a new, unexpected notification shimmered into existence on the periphery of the central projection. It was a transmission packet, highly compressed and encoded in a complex, non-Vesnara mathematical language, overlaid with an unmistakable pattern of perfect, non-chaotic regularity. The message did not originate from the human ships themselves, but appeared to be a direct, unauthorized insertion into the hegemony's secure communication network, bypassing multiple layers of firewalls that had been operational for millennia. The sages momentarily ceased their argument, stunned into unified silence by the sheer impossibility of the intrusion. The Sentinel array, the primary defense perimeter, was absolutely inviolable, designed to repel any attempt at informational breach through the brute force application of gravitational shear. Only a species with a computational superiority vastly beyond the Vesnara's own capacity, or a fundamentally different physics model, could achieve such a silent, seamless insertion. Kalen, his political victory granted by the terrifying reality of the new data, commanded the chief data analyst, a young, visibly panicked Vesnara technician stationed in the pit below, to decrypt the packet under maximum security protocols. The subsequent data stream that flooded the chromium disk was not a communication of threat, nor of aggression, but a crystalline, perfectly logical statement in the universal dialect of pure mathematics, a language that bypassed all cultural and linguistic barriers, speaking only to the hegemony's core philosophical understanding of existence. It was a single, devastatingly elegant equation that modeled the exact behavior of the corrosive blight, identifying its informational weak points, and concluding with a simple, three-word message rendered in the Vesnara's ancient pictographic script, a script they themselves had ceased to use 5,000 cycles prior. We are here. The effect was cataclysmic, a cognitive rupture in the conclave's collective understanding of reality. This was not the chaotic, unstable signal of a crude, accelerated species. This was the calm, surgical precision of a mind operating on a level of conceptual understanding that dwarfed their own. The dangerous ships, the vessels whose erratic gravitational wake had been interpreted as instability, were in fact performing a complex, simultaneous series of computational manipulations on spacetime itself, using reality as a canvas for their thoughts. The Vesnara had mistaken perfect control for violent instability. Zarthus's ancient faceplate registered a momentary, terrifying flicker of something akin to genuine fear, a reaction that had not been seen on the face of a high-ranking Vesnara in countless centuries. Kalen, however, felt a cold, dreadful calm descend, the unsettling realization that he was witnessing the arrival of a truly superior intellect, one that did not operate on the spectrum of war or peace, but on the higher, more terrifying spectrum of logic and mandate. The debate shifted instantly from whether to destroy them to a desperate, internal scramble to understand the nature of the entity that had just effortlessly infiltrated the highest security echelon of their dying empire, a moment that marked the true end of the Vesnara hegemony's self-determined narrative. The realization settled upon the sages with the crushing finality of a collapsing star. They had spent cycles debating the arrogance of a species they presumed to be primitive, only to find that this species had already achieved an incomprehensible level of ethical and scientific synthesis, one that allowed them to approach an existential crisis not with fire and kinetic force, but with an algebraic solution. The human vessels, which now held positions of perfect geometric stillness far outside the perimeter, a stillness that belied their earlier misleading movements, had not been waiting for an invitation. They had been observing, performing a complete informational autopsy of the Vesnara collapse, and then, without recourse to negotiation or the messy process of interspecies diplomacy, had rendered their verdict and presented their solution. Their arrival at the nexus of the Vesnara's mythological and actual demise, the point where all hope had been culturally and politically defined as lost, was now seen not as a coincidence, but as a deliberate, symbolic statement of purpose, a stark, unsettling demonstration of their total awareness of the situation's precise emotional and historical gravity. The communication that followed, once the conclave had managed to formulate a response that did not betray the terrifying depth of their cognitive submission, was a masterclass in calm, clinical professionalism. The human designated as Ambassador Alara Vance appeared not as a projection of imposing scale or martial might, but as a direct, unadorned holographic representation against the chaotic backdrop of the Vesnara's crumbling projection. Her appearance was biologically unremarkable, a bipedal structure, a soft, unthreatening vocal cadence, and eyes that held an unnerving, steady clarity, devoid of the complex, twitching nervousness that Vesnara diplomacy considered the necessary indicator of respect. She spoke the hegemony's primary transactional language, Valonic, with a precise, accentless fluency that suggested computational mastery rather than slow, linguistic study. Yet her words carried a weight of ethical density that immediately eclipsed the Vesnara's millennia of accumulated philosophy. Sages of the Vesnara conclave, Ambassador Vance began, her voice a low, steady frequency that seemed to cut through the chamber's dampening field without effort. We acknowledge receipt of your formal transmission, which we have translated as a request for situational assessment and non-aggressive intervention protocols. Our analysis of the informational entity you term the corrosive blight is complete. Its structure is not biological, but a self-propagating informational cascade, a corrupted data stream designed to destabilize complex computational arrays through the introduction of recursive logical paradoxes. It is, in effect, a highly optimized, localized entropic function. The blight is not a threat to life in the traditional sense, but to order. Your attempts to combat it using kinetic force, thermal disruption, or traditional firewall arrays have failed because you have attempted to quarantine the result, not the root code. Furthermore, we have identified the source signature. It is an automated, high-level maintenance PR. Autocall that has suffered an isolated corruption event. A subroutine of a far larger, long-dormant systemic architecture that your hegemony's technology has inadvertently awakened through the specific frequency of your aging warp drives. The revelation was delivered with the dispassionate tone of an administrative report, yet its implications were a staggering cultural annihilation. The catastrophic end of the Vesnara hegemony, the existential threat that had crippled their empire and forced them to confront their own limitations, was not a cosmic enemy, but an ancient, malfunctioning janitorial service of an unknown, previous galactic power. Zarthus recoiled visibly, his sensor filaments collapsing inward, a gesture of profound, wounded pride. Kalen, however, leaned forward, his dread slowly being replaced by a terrifying intellectual curiosity. "Ambassador Vance," Kalen responded, forcing a tone of measured calm, "your computational models are undeniably superior, a fact that forces a painful reevaluation of our entire cosmological standing. But your solution, transmitted moments ago, the introduction of a meta-informational cascade, is mathematically sound, yet physically impossible under Vesnara physics. It requires a level of controlled temporal and gravitational manipulation that we had designated as purely theoretical, achievable only with universal constants that defy practical application. How can a species whose technological signature we had designated as crude possess the mastery to execute this?" Ambassador Vance's steady gaze remained fixed, her response immediate and delivered without the slightest pause for deliberation. "Your designation was correct, Sage Kalen, in its original context. Humanity, as an emergent species, spent centuries embroiled in self-destructive internecine conflict. Our technological acceleration was indeed divorced from ethical mastery. We nearly extinguished ourselves not through lack of intelligence, but through a profound, catastrophic failure of empathy and perspective. The dangerous ships were, at one point, tools of terrifying, uncontrolled destruction, weapons used against our own kind with reckless abandon. We were saved from terminal collapse not by a single invention, but by a collective, devastating moment of species-wide philosophical clarity. A societal shift so profound, it is now simply referred to in our history as the Great Calibration. We realized that true, sustainable power is not the ability to destroy reality, but the absolute control required to preserve it. Our current mastery of physics is not a triumph of intellect alone, but the direct, pragmatic consequence of an unwavering ethical mandate. The gravitational control you observe is not a crude output. It is the perfect, computationally efficient expression of our primary protocol: harmonize and stabilize. The vessels are dangerous only to a system that assumes chaos is the default state of the universe. To us, the calculus is simple. A civilization facing an existential, informational collapse is an inherently unstable system, and its stabilization becomes the highest ethical priority, superseding all concerns of political non-interference or territoriality. Our current capabilities, our dangerous ships, are merely the tools of a comprehensive, universal first-response ethics. This was the core of the human reveal, a cultural contrast so vast it was almost incomprehensible to the Vesnara. They had expected a conqueror driven by greed, a desperate supplicant, or an aggressive warlord. They received a meticulous, almost frighteningly ethical engineer of universal stability. The deep world-building aspect revealed here was the source of human power, not superior invention, but superior moral application of terrifying power. They had weaponized their own historical failures into an operational ethical framework. Zarthus, his intellectual rigidity momentarily bypassed by the sheer, cold logic of her explanation, finally spoke, his voice tinged with genuine, unfamiliar confusion. "Your species has suffered a profound, self-inflicted wound, a near-extinction event, and your response is to dedicate your entire technological capability to the preservation of others. That is an inverted survival instinct. It is illogical. It does not prioritize the preservation of the self. What is the return on this ethical investment? What is the strategic advantage you seek to gain from the expenditure of such vast resources and risk on a failing, politically exhausted culture such as ours?" Ambassador Vance's holographic form seemed to project a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, a slight alteration in the ambient light that suggested a deep, internal sigh of galactic-scale patience. "Sage Zarthus, your question is rooted in the calculus of the competitive scarcity model, a paradigm that humanity has, by painful necessity, long since discarded. The return is not material nor territorial. The strategic advantage is systemic redundancy. A stable galactic civilization is a more stable environment for all. A catastrophic collapse, such as the one threatening the Vesnara hegemony, creates ripples of informational and gravitational chaos that eventually threaten all adjacent systems, including our own. We stabilize your collapse not out of sentiment, but out of a profound, pragmatic self-interest that is calculated over the deep cosmological timeline. Furthermore, your hegemony represents a vast, unique store of historical, philosophical, and scientific data. The preservation of this unique cultural complexity is, to humanity, a non-negotiable metric. We do not seek to rule you. We seek only to prevent the tragic, wasteful destruction of irreplaceable knowledge. Our dangerous ships are not here to wage war, but to perform a planetary-scale surgical operation, an act of preservation dictated by a logic that transcends petty local self-interest. The large-scale reveal followed immediately, a demonstration that rendered all further political debate irrelevant. Ambassador Vance did not wait for formal permission, as her mandate superseded the Vesnara's local authority. We have calculated the precise parameters for the Blight's neutralization. We will now proceed with the deployment of the informational cascade. This procedure will require a temporary, controlled collapse of all Vesnara high-level computational arrays for a period of 4.7 cycles, a necessary measure to prevent recursive infection. The entire Vesnara military fleet must hold position, passive and immobile, as the energy signature of any active drive could destabilize the field harmonics. Do not attempt to analyze the cascade. Its informational density will result in a cognitive feedback loop in your processors. Submit to the operation, and the core systems will be stabilized. Resist, and the Blight's advance will proceed to terminal velocity within the designated time frame. With that pronouncement, the display on the chromium disk changed utterly. The human fleet, still holding their perfectly silent positions, began to exude not the erratic gravitational chaos previously recorded, but a synchronized, stunningly uniform projection of controlled, deep-field energy. It was a wave of pure, tightly contained informational density, so complex it manifested visually as a silent, iridescent shimmering that enveloped the contested zone. The Vesnara sages watched helplessly as the very structure of the corrosive blight, the vectors of chaos and entropy that had defeated their entire empire, began to falter, then to reverse, and finally to dissolve into an ordered state of non-existence, overwritten by the elegant, logical certainty of the human counter-protocol. The dangerous ships had, with a single synchronized deployment, neutralized the existential crisis of the Vesnara hegemony, proving themselves not as weapons of war, but as instruments of absolute, terrifying control over the very laws of reality. The sheer professionalism of the act, its clinical lack of drama or demand for gratitude, was a deeper, more profound form of power than any war fleet could have projected. Kalen watched the chromium disk register the shift to system stabilization, 99.99% operational, and understood that the Vesnara hegemony in its current form had just ended, replaced not by a conqueror, but by a curator, an entity whose power derived from a higher, less selfish moral dimension. The shame of their arrogance was absolute, and the realization of their profound, terrifying underestimation of the human species was the final, devastating collapse of their old world. The stabilization phase lasted precisely 4.7 Vesnara cycles, during which the conclave of 9 sages remained frozen in their observation posts, unable to intervene, communicate, or even fully comprehend the magnitude of the operation unfolding around their core systems. The silence in the chamber of static reflection was now heavier, imbued not with political tension, but with the paralyzing weight of intellectual and existential debt. They had been saved, yet the very act of salvation was a humiliating testament to their own stagnation. When Ambassador Vance finally re-established the secure channel, the atmosphere had shifted from hostile debate to one of profound, reluctant deference. Sages, Vance stated, the word carrying a neutral, professional inflection that nonetheless sounded utterly definitive. The core systems are stabilized. The localized entropic function is neutralized. We have placed passive, automated informational sentinels at the structural nexus points of the ancient architecture to prevent recurrence. Your systems are now operating outside the influence of the corrosive blight. We will maintain a perimeter presence for a period of 3 planetary rotations to ensure the stability of the new equilibrium. Our primary objective is complete. There was no demand for tribute, no request for territory, and no imposition of political treaty. an absence that was itself the most terrifying demonstration of human power. They did not need Vesnara resources. Their own internal resources and technological superiority made the Vesnara's material wealth irrelevant. Sage Kalen, now the de facto leader by virtue of his earlier, cautious pragmatism, offered a formal, agonizingly difficult submission, the words themselves a historical concession of defeat. Ambassador Vance, the Vesnara hegemony is, by your intervention, preserved from a certain terminal collapse. Our ancient philosophical texts possess no terminology adequate to express the depth of this obligation. We had categorized your species as an unstable, accelerated threat, the summation of our deepest xenophobic fears. Your demonstration of controlled capability, ethical maturity, and profound, pragmatic altruism has rendered our entire structure of cosmological understanding obsolete. We were wrong. You are not a threat to order, but its ultimate enforcers. We must now inquire as to the terms of your withdrawal, or the necessary framework for a continued, structured alliance under the auspices of a species whose wisdom is demonstrably superior to our own. The other sages, including the humbled Zarthus, could only give the traditional, silent Vesnara sign of assent, a slow, deep rotation of their harnesses that confirmed the political and cultural capitulation. The old pride was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling gratitude that felt more like submission than respect. Ambassador Vance, however, did not acknowledge the act of fealty. Her gaze, focused and unchanging, subtly shifted its intensity, the first deviation from her clinical composure. The formal structures of alliance and interspecies obligations can be addressed by the mandated diplomatic corps once our immediate secondary objective is complete. However, Sage Kalen, the operation is not fully concluded. During the final moments of the informational cascade deployment, specifically when the human matrices achieved the required depth of temporal manipulation to rewrite the Blight's core code, our long-range detection systems registered a profound anomaly. Our sensors, operating at a level of resolution far beyond your current capacity, detected a faint, highly compressed signal. This signal was entirely masked by the Blight's informational noise and would have remained undetectable were it not for the precise moment of informational silence we created. This signal did not originate from your systems, nor the ancient architecture we neutralized. It emanates from the deep void, far outside the galactic plane, and is traveling at a velocity that defies the known limitations of subspace communication. This was the pivot, the moment the local, existential crisis of the Vesnara hegemony was transcended by a larger, terrifying cosmic reality. The humans, the unexpected saviors who arrived when all hope was lost, were now the harbingers of a revelation that dwarfed their initial conflict. "What is the nature of this signal, Ambassador?" Kalen asked, the initial relief of salvation evaporating, replaced by a cold, dreadful apprehension. Signal is a data packet, incredibly dense, estimated to contain the historical archive of a civilization that preceded your hegemony by an estimated 30 millennia, Vance responded, her voice regaining its low, formal gravity. Our initial decryption analysis is partial, but the key information has been cross-referenced. The civilization that built the vast, ancient architecture we just stabilized, the one that spawned your Blight as a maintenance subroutine, was not the original architect. They were merely the custodians. The true author was the civilization that sent this signal, the precursor hegemony, an entity that spanned this entire quadrant of the cosmos before the Vesnara even achieved interstellar flight. The signal is not an open transmission. It is a locked navigational marker, designed to be received only by systems capable of processing specific, high-level temporal and gravitational harmonics. Systems like those found within our own dangerous ships, which you so rightly designated as fundamentally disruptive to conventional physics. Ambassador Vance paused, allowing the weight of this historical and scientific cataclysm to settle upon the sages. Their entire cosmological timeline, the history upon which their political and cultural pride was based, had just been reduced to a minor, middle-stage stewardship of someone else's ruins. The signal's purpose, Vance continued, her tone now possessing an almost reverent, chilling solemnity, is to direct the receiver to a specific, non-conventional point in the galactic void, far beyond the reach of the known star systems. It is not directing us to a colony, a historical archive, or a treasury. It directs us to what the partial decryption labels the dimensional anchor. Zarthus, momentarily forgetting his humiliation, finally broke the silence, his voice now a mere whisper of its former arrogance. A dimensional anchor, what is its function? A weapon? A fortress? It is neither, Sage Zarthus, Vance stated, and the content of her next sentence was the true, terrifying reveal, the ultimate twist of the narrative. The initial structural schematics contained within the signal indicate that the dimensional anchor is not a structure built to attack or defend against a known enemy. It is a cosmological containment device. The precursor hegemony did not disappear due to internal collapse, nor did they face a traditional military threat. They constructed the dimensional anchor to seal this quadrant of the universe from an entity or force that operates outside the four primary dimensions. A cosmic threat that the precursors could only describe in metaphor as the silent null. The blight, the information cascade that nearly extinguished your civilization, was merely one of the automated, self-replicating seals on the anchor, a security measure designed to destroy any lower-level, technologically disruptive civilization that got close enough to accidentally tamper with the containment fields. Your hegemony's collapse was not a failure of will, but a symptom of accidentally disturbing the grave of an older, far more terrifying conflict. The chamber of static reflection had never felt so cold, so silent, or so small. The Vesnara sages had been struggling with the concept of their own demise, a local, understandable tragedy. Now they were confronted with the reality that their entire corner of the cosmos was a meticulously sealed cage, and that the force that had been the unwitting author of their near extinction was merely the lock. Their salvation by humanity, the arrival of the dangerous ships, was now recast as a cosmic key, a necessary catalyst that created the informational vacuum required to hear the desperate, final warning of a 30,000-year-old civilization. The signal ends with a final, non-encrypted warning addressed to the receiver, Ambassador Vance concluded, her voice now carrying a deep, resonant tone of philosophical gravity that matched the epic scale of the revelation. It states, "The seal must not be broken. The null does not consume, it merely observes, and its observation is the erosion of existence. If this message is received, the seal is already weakening. You, the inheritor, must now assume the vigil. Your power must be absolute, your purpose, unwavering, and your ethical mandate, the only barrier against the return of the silent null." A deep, emotional realization washed over Sage Kalen, a terrifying clarity that settled the chaos of the last cycles. The arrogance of the Vesnara, their belief in their own supremacy, had been a necessary delusion that had kept them focused on local politics, preventing them from achieving the kind of power that would have allowed them to accidentally breach the Great Seal. Humanity, however, with their dangerous ships, their mastery of temporal and gravitational control born from their painful ethical calibration, possessed the exact type of power, the absolute control, the message had demanded. They were the inheritors of the Vigil, the only species capable of handling the operational parameters of the dimensional anchor and the philosophical horror of the silent null. The alliance was not a political agreement, but a cosmological necessity, formed not between equals, but between the saved and the savior, united by a terrifying, new, far greater threat. Kalen looked at the holographic image of Ambassador Vance, seeing not a diplomat, but a figure of quiet, absolute strength, a strength forged in the crucible of self-inflicted annihilation and refined by a ruthless, pragmatic dedication to the stability of the entire system. The humans had arrived when all hope was lost, their ships deemed dangerous, and they had not only saved the Vesnara, but had provided the entire quadrant with a new, terrifying purpose. Kalen spoke, his voice finally shedding the last vestiges of political maneuvering, carrying the raw, unified sincerity of an entire species coming to terms with its true, minor role in the galactic tapestry. Ambassador Vance, humanity. The Vesnara hegemony cedes all local authority in this sector to the human mandate. We offer our entire historical and scientific archive, our remaining resources, and our personnel to the Vigil. Our ships, now rendered non-disruptive under your guidance, are yours to command. You arrived when we faced our own small, pathetic end, and you have instead granted us a terrifying, grander beginning. We understand now why your technology is so fearsome, why your ships are deemed dangerous. They are the only tools capable of managing the ultimate existential threat. They are dangerous only to the things that seek chaos. Lead us, Ambassador. Show us how to assume the Vigil. We are ready to learn the true calculus of control, the power that is born of ethical clarity, the power that can stand against the observation of the silent null. The finality of his surrender was not humiliating, but profoundly liberating. The political stagnation was over. The era of the Vesnara was eclipsed, replaced by the ascent of humanity, the calm, logical inheritors of a cosmic burden. Ambassador Vance gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of solemn acceptance, not triumph. The vigil begins now, sages. The dimensional anchor is the new frontier. We will navigate the deep void, and we will assume the ancient charge. Prepare your vessels. We have much work to do. The holographic image faded, leaving the sages in the crushing, informative silence of the chamber. The projected image on the chromium disk now no longer showing the collapsed systems of the Vesnara, but the incomprehensible, starless expanse of the deep void, with a single, highly controlled vector tracing the path toward the legendary, terrifying dimensional anchor. The dangerous ships were already moving, not in a charge of war, but in a silent, methodical progression toward the ultimate cosmic unknown, led by an ethical mandate forged in the fires of their own darkest history, a power that made them the necessary, terrifying, and profoundly hopeful future of the entire galactic quadrant. This was the Unity, a terrifying, silent pact made under the shadow of a threat that defied understanding, an alliance forged not in shared victory, but in shared, absolute responsibility. The only hope lost was the hope of remaining small,